Welcome to the State of the Globe podcast from the Global Governance Institute in Brussels. My name is Joe Korps, and in this podcast we examine core issues related to all things that matter in the realm of global challenges and global problem solving. This episode is the second of the State of the Globe mini-series on the governance of artificial intelligence. I sit down again with David Timis, who is a senior fellow here at GGI and has far-reaching expertise and experience in both the private and public sector related to the economic and societal implications of artificial intelligence. After the previous episode's focus on AI's impact in work and education, today we dive more deeply into the details of the international dimension of AI. We examine the different dimensions of the so-called global AI race, with a particular focus on the US-China rivalry in the 5 layers of AI: energy, chips, infrastructure, models and apps, and also explore the impact on Europe, including the role of the EU AI Act. As a disclaimer, it might be a little bit technical in the beginning, but it is well worth listening to the episode in full to understand the different dimensions of this AI race. Enjoy the episode. David, good to have you back. The previous episode, we talked a little bit about the impact of AI on work and education. Today, it's the international dimension, both what is happening at the international level, who is pressing forward, who is maybe left behind in the so-called AI race, even though there is some discussion we can also have if it is really a race or if it should be a race. And then also, of course, bringing it back to the EU AI Act. There is some, let's say, rolling back going on right now when it comes about safety and security issues. And looking both again at risks and opportunities. But before we delve into all of that, maybe could you lay out a little bit for us what is happening at the international dimension? I mean, who is pushing forward here? What are the implications also on different resources or technologies that are needed, and so on and so forth?
Sure. Thank you for having me back on the podcast. So indeed, it's fundamentally a question of who calls it a race and who doesn't, because at least from a narrative perspective, the US clearly calls it a race. Their whole AI strategy is how to position the US as a winner or how to make US win. The Chinese don't communicate in a similar fashion. They prefer to be a bit more ambiguous about whether or not they're in a race or not, but in reality, they are competing for the same scarce resources, be it the energy or the chips, with the US. So they're definitely in a race, albeit maybe a different one, because whilst the US is focusing on developing ever more capable frontier AI models, which they're the best positioned to do, to reach the nirvana of AI, quote unquote, the AGI or transformative AI, TAI. AGI stands for Artificial General Intelligence, this incredibly powerful AI that could technically, if we are to take even OpenAI's mission, could do all economically viable work, first in the knowledge economy and then also in the sort of a brown collar economy as well. But these are clearly the two competitors, and then there's everybody else. And when I say everybody else, it's where also the EU is positioning itself currently, a sort of a more of a regulatory power that hasn't yet come to terms with its own strengths, because Europe has strengths in this space. We have the UK, which is playing a very smart, I would say, given their position post-Brexit, but also a very pragmatic way to sit between the US and the EU and to partner with the American tech companies, given that they just couldn't compete otherwise, but at the same time still have their own approach to it. Then we have the South Asian middle powers. So we have Taiwan, we have Japan, we have South Korea, which all play key roles, especially when it comes to memory, to manufacturing chips, which is the case of Taiwan. The advanced chips, I mean, because we also manufacture chips in Europe and also in the US, but less capable ones than the ones developed or manufactured by Samsung in South Korea and TSMC in Taiwan. And then there's again, I would call it a third tier of countries which are maybe not middle powers necessarily. They're countries maybe like Brazil, in other countries in Latin America or both North Africa, but also Sub-Saharan Africa, countries that are trying to keep up and to have maybe their open source local AI models that at least adhere to local language, dialects, and culture, but they clearly are not in any race and probably will not be in the foreseeable future. And maybe as a last note on this, which I maybe should have used as the starting point of our conversations, is what is this framework that you judge whether or not a country is a winner or a loser in the AI race? And I would use a very, I think, astute framework provided by Jensen Huang, the founder and CEO of NVIDIA. He called it the 5-layer cake of AI. And the basis is compute, of course, NVIDIA chips for the training of large language models, but now increasingly more so, not just the GPUs NVIDIA designs, but also CPUs. And we've seen in recent weeks companies like AMD and ARM increase their stock market price, given the now focus on no longer just training, but also inference.
Sorry, CPU stands for?
Central Processing Units. GPUs is graphic processing units. Again, GPUs and CPUs were mostly very useful in video games in the past, and increasingly more so there's been multiple applications for the chips. The latest and most exciting is obviously to deploy them in data centers, but also in phones. When you speak about CPUs, there's most of our digital devices, including the laptop in front of you or our phones, are filled with CPUs in particular. CPUs and GPUs are what they call logic chips. And we also have memory chips, which are also now in high demand. And since you asked me to take this side note, we have two big challenges when it comes to chips. And neither of them are necessarily the NVIDIA-related challenges that we don't have an equivalent to NVIDIA in Europe or in other parts of the world. It's actually, at the moment at least, the bigger challenges is the foundry, who manufactures the leading-edge chips, and by a overwhelming percentage is TSMC in Taiwan, and to a lesser degree, but still very powerful, Samsung in South Korea. And the other key challenge is who manufactures, not just, and I was referring now again to the GPUs, so TSMC, Samsung in particular, they develop the GPUs that NVIDIA needs, and in turn, OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google needed initially to develop these incredible large language models or LLMs. But then we have the memory chip drought, which has started as of last year, but this year more and more people have come to terms that actually memory chips developed by SK Hynix and Samsung, again, two South Korean players, and as a third power in the space is Micron from the US. So now the biggest bottleneck when it comes to chips per se is not just not having enough NVIDIA chips or maybe in the near future CPUs, it's actually having the high bandwidth memory chips, chips that I mentioned earlier, and having a place to manufacture them, because just TSMC and Samsung don't have the right capacity. Hence why Elon Musk is now, let's see if it's going to be in reality or if he'll actually deliver on his promises this time. He's implementing what they call a sort of a Terra factory. He's trying to manufacture his own chips, and he recently struck a partnership amongst other semi-providers with Intel, which is the prodigal son of the semiconductor industry in the US, which has been, I would say, even saved by the US government in recent months with I think $10 billion subsidy. And now with Tesla, it could be their chance to be back as a relevant foundry, because they've lost the race with TSMC and Samsung some time ago, because they didn't decide to partner with the European champion, ASML, which makes the machines that then TSMC, Samsung, and Intel could have bought to manufacture this leading edge chip. So I'm now covering just bits and pieces of just the chip layer, which as you see is very, very complex. Just ASML alone, despite being this incredible company, one-of-a-kind company developing these large machines, $100 billion machines almost, for developing these leading edge chips, they depend on 5,000 suppliers across Europe, Asia, America, where they also have R&D. So I just gave you a glimpse into the chip layer, the first layer of this sort of a 5-layer AI stack, or AI cake, as Jensen Huang called it. The next one is energy. And as a side note already, and I mentioned this so I don't forget because it's very key and maybe not often enough discussed at the EU level, energy is at the moment the bottleneck, not chips. Yeah, there's elements, as I said, in the chip space that are not there in a high enough quantity, not enough foundry capacity, not enough high bandwidth memory. But essentially, the foundries are being built in the US and in Southeast Asia. The glut will hopefully be behind us in a couple of years, but the energy build out is much slower, especially in Europe, especially in the US. And the challenge in Europe, which is not yet or not as much discussed as I would like to, is we live in the continent, in the area in the world that has the highest prices for energy. Mm-hmm. And when you're talking about a technology, AI, that depends and is bottlenecked currently mainly by energy amongst any other element, we're definitely the worst placed in the world to solve this issue. But we do have, if we play it a bit more strategically, we do have nuclear power plants, a few left in France. We do have solar and wind, especially in Scandinavia, in Spain. We just have to double down on that and streamline regulation to build even more, to be even close to competing with the US. And forget about it, we have no chance to compete with China because neither the US and Europe obviously could compete, given that it's a very different political context in China, but also with this idea of they just build more gigawatts of power than any other place in the world. So energy is a huge bottleneck. And now I'm going to just quickly run through the last three layers, which I think we're still early, let's say, in this other three layers, because we're still living in the early innings of AI, which is the infrastructure paradigm, the chips and the energy. The nuclear, the power plants, the gas turbines, increasingly more so nuclear microreactors, solar, wind, thermal, so all these energy sources. Mm-hmm. And now we're at the third layer, which is the models themselves, mm-hmm. which many have argued in the past and some have changed their minds since, that they will be commoditized and that you cannot make money if you're an OpenAI or an Anthropic, which is being proven a bit wrong. Albeit they're not profitable yet, but looking at their latest annual recurring revenue, both Anthropic and OpenAI are probably the most successful, fastest growing companies in history. Let's see if they could indeed monetize continuously at the same rate, which is a big question. They've 10x'd, Anthropic has 10x'd, and even their own CEO said, well, we're now at, I think this was last year's interview that I've recently re-listened, and they were at $10 billion. 10xing from that would be 100 billion. So it's a bit difficult, but the growth is incredible. Let's see if they're going to be able to maintain it. Mm-hmm. And one other model I do need to mention is on the closed source side is Google DeepMind. So these are the three players. We have one European player that is not even in the top 5, which is Mistral, but still it's our own. We have to love it and cherish it and support it even more than we do so far.
That's a French system?
Mistral AI is a French one, right. Indeed. We had, and this is breaking news, especially breaking news for the EU bubble, since I don't know how many people follow the same sort of tech investment news that I follow. Our German provider, Aleph Alpha, was just, and I don't want to be, don't quote me on this, I don't know if it was a acqui-hire, so if the other company just acquired their leadership mm-hmm. and IP, like NVIDIA did with Grok mm-hmm. recently for improving their sort of inference chips, or it was fully an acquisition, but Cohere from Canada, another smaller AI large language model provider, acqui-hired or hired or fully bought the only quote-unquote champion we had in Germany, Aleph Alpha. So now it really is down just to Mistral AI to be our European large language model champion. Mm-hmm. And then this is all what I'm talking about so far. It's mostly closed source. So OpenAI, Anthropic, Google DeepMind, they have build their business on closed source with lesser powerful models that they open source as well. Whilst on the other side of the continent or of the world, we have China, which has built their whole AI model stack on open source, given that they just couldn't compete with the US on closed source. And it's much easier to distill a model to basically use a much more powerful model that you take from the US, open source models available, and you use that much more powerful model to distill a smaller open source model that you can then scale and send out to the world, like China is trying to do with DeepSeek, for instance, which is one of their most famous ones, but also Alibaba, mm-hmm. the cloud giant, had Qwen, which is also great open source models. And what China has done, basically China has swept the floor under Meta's feet, because Meta, the company of Mark Zuckerberg, was the initial open source champion with their Llama series of models, which is no longer the case. And they recently tried to revamp their whole super intelligence team to come back on top, and they're still far from the top, but they're at least relevant still. And Meta would be maybe, in their defense, the fourth biggest American closed source model.
Can you just quickly clarify the difference between open source and closed source models, those that might not know it, and why does it make a difference?
Closed source models are going to be, at least for the foreseeable future, the more powerful models, the models that the companies initially develop and then sell to their, be it private customers, enterprises, and so on. Open source models, at least if we use the American approaches, the models that have an open source IP. Anybody can basically take some of the technology and develop their own ecosystem around it. It's something that has been done in the past with the battle between Apple with their iOS and Google coming along and trying to take their flame, so to say, and realizing it's very hard to make a dent into Apple's moat built around iOS and their developer base. And Google came up with this brilliant idea of coming up with Android, another operating model that is open source that Samsung is now using and other providers. Similarly, open source is one way to make sure that your model is the one being used by other developers, other companies.
So other companies and products
exactly.
can use it, and whereas Apple, the platform, is just for Apple.
Exactly,
and
same with LLMs. Same with LLMs. The closed source ones are, as the name says, it's only OpenAI, Anthropic, or Google can use it, and they're usually the most capable models that you have to now pay increasingly more money for, given the constraints, both energy and chip-related constraints and token constraints. So maybe another side note: what's a token? Because you often hear this maybe terminology and how many thousands, and maybe in the not that distant future, millions of tokens some people consume, especially engineers in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. Tokens are the way that LLMs actually look at the text. The token is maybe in some cases a character, it's part of a word or a short word in itself. And the number of tokens is literally how many parts of a word can that large language model process. And given your subscription plan, how many you can actually use, because many people are now reaching limits to the number of tokens they can use. And the more you upload maybe a big book that you ask the LLM to go through, that goes into your sort of token number that you have allocated with your freemium account, or if it's a paid account, there's also limitations there.
Right.
So closed source, open source, closed source clearly in the lead, but not by far. Some say 3 months, other people say 6 months. It's the US in closed source models, the leading models, the ones that are now in this sort of a pursuit of artificial general intelligence or transformative AI, as other people call it. And then China is leading big on open source, which is also another, some would say, not insidious, but maybe insidious ways to kind of take over the game of AI by making sure that not everybody will need the latest model from an American provider. A decent model from China could do. That's their pitch. Of course, that comes with the geopolitical angle, the ethical angle. In the aftermath of the Huawei scandals, I still don't see that many European and American providers go to the Chinese models per se, as maybe big companies or governments, but individuals are. And that's why the open source models from China are globally the most used, not just in China itself.
Okay. And so, and you know roughly region-wise where the big users are concentrated? I mean, is it outside the Western hemisphere? Or
it's a great question. I don't know the percentages, but I know for sure it's mostly in the vicinity of China. So it's Southeast Asia, India as well, of course, because India is one of the countries that, even though they're by many accounts a middle power, maybe even a future superpower, when it comes to AI development and having their own models, they're maybe in the same camp more with Brazil.
Right.
So they still have a lot to go.
So it's a strategic objective for China to make sure as many users as possible go to this model.
Yes, if you want to make a parenthesis or a parallel, is what China has done with their one road, one belt strategy, with all their investments in infrastructure. They sort of pushed it as, we help you country Y or X develop, modernize, but then we own your infrastructure. Similarly, they're trying to play kind of the same strategy here. Use our open source models if you trust us, meaning the government there, because obviously the government works much more closely with the tech companies in China. That is the case in Europe and even in the US, where the relationship has been getting closer and closer, but still not anything comparable to what is in China for decades. But yeah, China wants basically the world to run on open source from China. And I don't want to open a Pandora's box now, but I do want us to revisit it at some point, because it's a huge debate in Silicon Valley, and hopefully at some point it will reach our shores as well, is the idea of whether or not NVIDIA in particular should or should not sell chips to China. But I'll park it here because, as I said, it's more of a Pandora's box.
We come back to that.
To finish the 5-layer stack, which I know I elaborated maybe even more than I wanted at first, but I think it's important to understand where we stand. So
absolutely.
Chips, energy, models, AI models. What's left? It's the data centers as well, the cloud providers that buy the data centers and the land that sits on them, that they sit on, sorry. It's the hyperscalers. So again, hyperscalers are Amazon with AWS, their cloud business, Google with their Google Cloud business, and Microsoft with their Microsoft Azure, which is their cloud business, and increasingly more so in recent years, Oracle, which is taking on huge record-breaking amounts of debt to reposition themselves as a relevant hyperscaler by building all these data centers and filling them with chips. Their advantage is that as compared to Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, they can just be the hyperscaler for all of their clients because they don't develop models and they don't have the chips that now Google develops and Amazon develops. So really, they're trying to position themselves as we're just going to serve you with the cloud.
Single focus business kind of thing.
Thing. And also there's now what they call in the tech space neo clouds, companies like CoreWeave, companies like Nebius Group, which is the former, very few people actually did the due diligence to check from what I see on X and other platforms. This is formerly Yandex, the Russian Google, who has, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has spinned off, very smartly their CEO, has spinned off in another company altogether registered in Amsterdam called Nebius Group, which builds data centers, and like other neo clouds, they basically either build or repurpose data centers, fill them up with NVIDIA GPUs and other relevant networking devices and so on, and servers, and lend that compute capacity to clients who cannot get enough from Microsoft, Amazon, and Google. Because one thing to mention about them, which differentiates them from Oracle, is the fact that they also have their own businesses that they need chips for. And if you look at all their quarterly earnings recently, Microsoft Azure in particular was put in a position that they couldn't serve enough of their enterprise Azure clients because they have their own needs. They develop their own LLMs to kind of wean themselves off OpenAI's models. And also, they have still OpenAI. They have a contractual agreement to provide data center capacity and compute capacity to OpenAI. Similar for Amazon, which now also has to do it for OpenAI and Anthropic. So because of this, it's even more complicated for them to provide as much compute as their clients need, hence Oracle's role, and hence the role of Nebius Group, Iron, which is an Australian provider, and CoreWeave. These are the three biggest probably neo-clouds. These companies that are purely just buying mostly on debt because they have made no profits prior.
Right.
They buy on debt data centers, they fill them up with, as I said, all the compute necessary, and then they lend out to clients that cannot get enough compute from the hyperscalers, basically.
And the Nebius Group you mentioned, that is still also then one could assume controlled by the Russian state?
No, I think it's been, based on my reading of the situation, their CEO has completely cut any ties for quite some time from Russia. At least that's what the papers say. That's what I've read. The company itself has, of course, taken a lot of the talent from Yandex, brilliant Russian engineers, but they've moved everything, all their operations, and as I said, they cut all ties based on what they declared with Russia. I personally always leave a room, a sort of a sliver of a doubt about any such things, because it's, of course, when you have a situation, a political dictatorship, for lack of a better term, like in Russia, I don't know how easy it is to cut ties. We see recently, as an anecdote, in China, one of the recent acquisitions of Meta to become again competitive in an LLM space, it's an agentic AI company from China called Manus, which the founders of Manus AI thought, we're going to outsmart the Chinese government, we're going to move our HQ in Singapore, and then we can sign off the acquisition papers, we can be sold to Meta and be billionaires. China blocked it because it's still a Chinese company in their eyes. It's still a valuable asset to the party and to the future of the country. And now there's obviously litigation involved and discussions whether or not Manus will actually still be acquired by Meta or not. So I would imagine Russia might still keep some ties, but again, don't quote me on this. This is purely speculation. Sure. The papers say they cut ties, and again, they're actually a European provider because they're based in Amsterdam.
Based in Amsterdam, yeah.
So that's our neo cloud from Europe that most people don't even associate with our strengths technically, because they are in the space neoclouds, a strength given that they're filling in a gap of companies are hungry, thirsty, whatever acronym or metaphor you want to use, for compute. Hyperscales will not be able to satisfy this demand. So neoclouds are needed. And we do have one that has an HQ in Europe.
By new cloud, you mean new companies beyond the usual three or four suspects?
Right. You really translated it. I guess that was I don't know the history of the name, but probably that's what it means indeed. Like you have the main major cloud providers, which are also called, and I've called, and maybe I should have explained, hyperscalers, because they're humongous companies that scale very quickly. Google, Amazon, Microsoft with their cloud businesses. Oracle and Meta could also be added there. OpenAI aspires to be a hyperscaler given the amount of compute and data center capacity they bought. And then the neoclouds, these small players which are shells in a way, because literally the CoreWeave used to be in the Bitcoin business, with cryptocurrency business before,
right,
for which compute and NVIDIA chips were also needed. If you remember during the pandemic, NVIDIA's first stock boom was not AI, was the cryptocurrency mania that was still based on NVIDIA chips that were able to do processing compute, which is this GPU advantage over CPUs. And some of the founders of these crypto-related companies, or miners as they're called in the crypto space, that are mining crypto, they were like, well, now the new wave is AI. Nobody really cares as much about crypto. So they repurposed the land they had to either build data centers or repurpose the data centers themselves with the existing chips that they had, not the latest versions, but still good enough, to now provide compute for clients, from governments to private companies. So that's the infrastructure data center cloud layer. And
layer 4, and now we have the fifth and last?
The fifth and last, and where if you ask Jensen Huang, and also I would agree with him on this one, the layer that probably carries the most promise when it comes to AI is the app layer. If we look at the internet revolution, which did end up with the dot-com bubble bursting, but at the essence of it, Cisco and Intel and other infrastructure providers lost a lot of their value. Funny enough, for those who watch the markets, only this past week was it Intel reached the same stock price as it did in 2000 before the crash, and Cisco reached it a few months ago, last year, I think, if I'm not mistaken, actually. So the infrastructure layer can, maybe even in this case, so the chips and the energy, experience a similar boom and bust cycle, which does mean that the app layer might be the companies who develop the apps that then end up on our phones and our devices that we actually experience AI and use AI, might be the winners of this game. There's many differences actually, but one of the differences between now and then is that the app layer is, in many cases, if not controlled, definitely overseen by a handful of large tech companies that already own the app layer in many ways. Apple, to some degree, given that they own iOS, and most of our interactions with AI happen actually now from an Apple device, be it a MacBook or an iPhone. Google, that obviously owns Android, but they are with the search engine, with YouTube, they have basically the way we access information online. Meta, which owns our social connections and communications online. Amazon, e-commerce, and so on. So what I'm trying to say is that the difference now, which might also keep this boom going on for longer, is that the companies already developing some of the apps or acquiring smaller players developing the apps, or companies that sit on very still good balance sheets and have the cash flow to continue powering this AI revolution for at least the foreseeable future. Was in the dot-com bubble, a lot of these pets.com kind of companies, the app layer of the internet era, were companies that were just, coming out of nowhere, trying to leverage the technology of the time, the internet, to make it big. There are signs that this is happening now as well. As another anecdote, I don't know if our listeners have seen this news. There's a shoe manufacturer in the US, which was not doing very well, which has spinned their business into AI. They're buying chips to sell it to clients, enterprise, and they used to do sneakers. It's just insane. So we do see a bit of this sort of companies jumping on this bandwagon and trying to fulfill this incredible demand for compute, even if they have nothing to do with it. But I do also expect an app layer to come along in the next few years that, Who knows? Will it be controlled by a big tech or by OpenAI and Anthropic who take over a large part of that ecosystem? Not the whole, because it's impossible. Maybe. Or maybe there's going to be enough room for more disruption to come, like in the .com time, by app layer providers, and they are now, that choose a niche and that they serve it really well and that they manage to stay private or become public companies but not be bought. We have maybe one example I always like to bring up, Harvey AI, which is an AI LLM specifically tailored for law firms and lawyers.
Right.
That's an area that none of the big techs wanted to get their hands, dirty with. I say dirty because it's obviously lots of guardrails, regulation. Mm-hmm. It's not difficult to be the LLM provider of a law firm. So Harvey has that space, and they're the leader by far in the world. Mm-hmm. Does this mean they will be able to go public successfully and all that before being acquired by one of these big tech? That remains an open question to be seen. But long story short, we have chips, energy, models, data centers, which are powered by the hyperscalers, and the application layer. This is the 5-layer stack that could make, if one country or region have leadership in all, could then actually make that country to fully and correctly call itself sovereign. If you miss one layer, you're not sovereign, in my view.
I was just about to say, exactly. Could you be, for example, a major player if you only have a combination of those, but not all of them? But you already answered that.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I mentioned it really also partly a bit sarcastically because we so often hear sovereignty in both European and American press. And I think we should, in many cases, and from psychology, I've learned this, the first step in change is sort of having this self-awareness to know what's wrong. And then also language plays a key role in delivering on that change that you wish to fulfill in your life or in your country's existence or a company's existence or whatnot. And if we keep calling it sovereignty, we're deluding ourselves because Europe is definitely not positioned to be fully sovereign, autarkic, fully independent on the AI or technology stack from any of its other friendly or less friendly potential partners. But not even the US and China are fully sovereign. However, they are the best positioned to have even a chance to aspire to that quote-unquote sovereignty. But there are still, each of them, missing key layers of the stack. So
that would be exactly the question. So if you say they're both not sovereign, what are they missing?
So China is missing the models for now, and both when it comes to the closed source models being the best, because theirs aren't. Their open source models are the best, but they're still not as capable as the closed source one, but they're definitely getting very close. And they also miss on the chip layer, big miss. They don't have their equivalent to NVIDIA, NVIDIA GPUs. They have Huawei, which is their leading provider, not just for telecommunications, but also for Ascend. Ascend is their line of GPUs. So they have an equivalent to NVIDIA that is not as capable as NVIDIA. And we do see that because the Chinese companies are still buying NVIDIA chips. Well, now because of the tariff war and whatnot, less so. But again, the NVIDIA chips are up for grabs, and either through transparent and direct means or via Singapore, Malaysia, and other third parties, NVIDIA chips are being bought. But the Chinese government is trying to push their tech AI frontier labs and big tech companies in China, the Alibabas of the world, the Baidus, the ByteDance, to buy Huawei's Ascend chips to wean themselves off from NVIDIA. But that hasn't been done yet. And the even bigger issue is on the foundry side. China doesn't control doesn't command the manufacturing prowess that Taiwan and TSMC has built over decades. And also, very importantly, they don't have, even if they control, let's say, the manufacturing and the processes, and they have tried in the past even to kidnap, former TSMC engineers to just try to catch up. They couldn't because they're missing then ASML, the Dutch equipment manufacturing provider that provides all these incredible devices that TSMC and Samsung are using to develop these leading edge chips. And what then people ask, but well, they're catching up, China, and they will eventually. Well, good luck, because catching up with ASML is not catching up with one company, it's catching up with 5,000. You need to replicate the all the suppliers. Full supply. Yeah. One of them being very important, that is maybe one of the, not the one, I don't want to put anybody on the sort of a second row here, but Zeiss, the optical German manufacturer, is one of the key providers that also the Chinese have found it very hard to replicate. And Zeiss works with ASML because, I don't want to get again too technical here, but ASML's technology, they're the only player which is developing a machine that can do extreme ultraviolet lithography. So they use these incredible lasers that are the most precise device ever created on Earth. And for the lasers to work, they do need lenses from Zeiss, the German manufacturer. This is just one of the connections that is needed for ASML to work and then for a Chinese equivalent to work. So to take a step back, China is still lacking on the closed source model by some say 3 or 6 months, or maybe longer, we see, and lacking by years when it comes to the chip manufacturing capacity, because they don't have the foundries that are equivalent to the leading edge foundries now, and even more so because they don't have an equivalent to ASML and their array of suppliers. What the US is missing is, well, they also miss chips, but they are doing their best to bring TSMC to Arizona and Samsung to collaborate now, I think, with Tesla as well, but they're missing energy, big time. So that's why in the US, the biggest bottleneck now is chips will remain a continuous bottleneck, but energy is the biggest bottleneck simply because you just cannot, even in the US, they do have legislation, of course, and it's hard to streamline permitting similar to as it is in Europe when it comes to building new power plants. Or that's why a lot of the effort was to decommission nuclear power plants and to retrofit gas turbines because GE, Vernova couldn't just sell enough. So energy is a huge bottleneck for the US, and I fear it's one of the hardest to solve because the difference between them and China, and don't quote me on the numbers, but it's I think a 10 or 20x difference in terms of the gigawatt capacity China has of energy, not just polluting energy, but renewable energy, because China is the biggest manufacturer of solar panels, and of course they sell a lot of them, but they also keep some for themselves. They are the leading providers in EVs, electric vehicles. So China is leading big time on the energy, and nobody sees really a path for even the US to properly catch up. The question is, what's the best they could do and still be able to power their data centers? Because as Jensen Huang says it, because he says it's a lot, he mentions the energy bottleneck. Nobody cares if you buy all my chips, I'm paraphrasing him, and you stuff them in a data center and that data center stays dark because you don't have the permitting or you don't have the cheap energy to actually power those data centers.
Yes, and that's of course then that interlinks the entire so-called AI race, and also with other aspects such as energy competition now, the geopolitics of energy, and at least partially an explanation for the energy hungry, or let's say the going back to oil strategy also that the US is driving now, partially I stress. Interesting. Lots to unpack, but very, very interesting and great that you laid it out in so much detail, because I think it rarely is being done in that way. So those 5 elements, again, chips, infrastructure, models, energy, and then apps are key. And maybe even drawing back to the last conversation we had, well, then the adoption and the user, of course, at the end of the day. But I think we covered that. Couple of questions that came to my mind, and I didn't want to stop your flow. When you say closed models and US models at the moment are still more profitable, is that profit from private investors, or is that also because of a large part of that share is public money, state contracts, and so on? I'm just asking again with my security hat on, because of course we see many of those companies having large, or at least those that still cooperate in the military sphere. Palantir, of course, large share of their income comes from government contracts, where of course famously Anthropic decided not to pursue it. Do you roughly know the split in terms of their income?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the percentage, but for sure, and I just to make sure I underline this, I mentioned first that the closed source models in the US are powerful, not profitable yet, meaning that they choose to remain unprofitable to feed every dollar they have into their growth. But that being said, for Anthropic in particular, their whole business is based on enterprise, B2B. That was their secret, and why I think they were brilliant, if I may take my tech strategist hat on, by not trying to do what OpenAI has done, which is to compete with Google, to compete with Apple, to think of doing a device. They were totally unfocused, and they're now going to be the first to admit it. And that detracted them from actually focusing on where the money is. And Anthropic did, which is coders and developing an AI that is great for coding and selling it to enterprises. And then consumers will also come, because everybody wants to use a technology that works at work in our own homes. It would happen now with personal computers. Interesting enough, and now if I am to take a even further step back, personal computers were not initially personal. They were computers that we, and Americans in particular, because they were the first again, had access to at work. Those huge IBM mainframes. Then Apple came along with their much more user-friendly devices, but you first tried them at work.
Sure.
That's where nowadays we also see that's where maybe it's your employer paying you as a programmer the subscriptions and the extra payments needed because you go over your token limit and so on, because these costs are getting to thousands of euros. There's now more and more CEOs that are no longer measuring their headcount needs just in terms of people, but in terms of compute.
Right.
These are realities both in the US and in China. But both US and China have global companies that have a footprint here in Europe. So their practices are obviously trickling down and diffusing in the European ecosystem. So that's also a question for us to ask ourselves, being European Europhiles and believing this European project, is how much can we stay away from these realities that is just on our shores already, even though we're not leading it, we're not the ones pushing it ahead.
Yeah. So before we move exactly how it affects other players, including Europe, one last question on, or is it last? I don't know. But one more question on the China-US competition over chips. So I mean, there's a lot of work on it. The chips wars and all these kind of publications that have come out. You already touched on it. NVIDIA, a key leader. But of course, the question is not only who produces the chips, but also the key components for the chips, raw materials, critical raw materials as well, which is now another geopolitical tension point. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Where do these two AI superpowers essentially get their critical raw materials from? Where they're located? Where are the kind of choke points, and what are the implications there?
Yeah, I think the joke is that rare earths are not that rare. They are available, and yes, China does control a lot of the extraction of rare earths from countries like Australia, Chile, for specific rare earths, but also within China itself. What though China dominates in is the processing of these rare earths, because they still decided, for reasons that now maybe in hindsight are obvious, that they will keep their polluting power plants and processing factories and whatnot, because obviously it's a different political system, and it was imposed on the people in the communities, which would have never worked in the US or Europe, for the good. Obviously, we prefer our skies to be cleaner, and we didn't want to have the same smog issues that Beijing had, and I think still has, in different seasons.
It's getting better,
though.
It was a huge problem.
But they are processing rare earths, and those rare earths are indeed key components of, and one in particular that I'm particularly interested in is copper, because many experts believe, and I'm one to double down on that maybe bet, that copper might be the rare earth that is not so rare, but that's going to be a bottleneck in the future, because we need copper for everything from data centers to EVs to all this sort of Internet of Things future we want to see in Europe and elsewhere, in which technology helps us have less traffic and safer working conditions and whatnot. We do need copper amongst other resources, and copper is another area where I think China controls 50% of its processing. And yeah, that's one other reason why I think the sovereignty discussion, and I'm glad you mentioned them, the rare earths, because that's one element that is not in the 5-layer cake that Jensen mentioned, but technically it's another huge lever that the Chinese government has. And it's also one in which, as we see now with what's happening in Iran, which the stock markets are not yet fully pricing in. It's like, yes, hopefully the war will end ASAP, but the rebuilding, if not, well, at least repair of the plants, the oil refineries there will take years. Similarly, to build new mines, new copper mines, will take years. So we'll have probably in the coming years more rare earths related bottlenecks, be it for their extraction, or if the relationships between China and the rest of the world, in particular the US and Europe, continue to be lukewarm, if not even cold, they could block a lot of the processing and put a lot of the world in a very dire situation. So that's one thing that now, in hindsight, I think, and there's a discussion, as if I am to make another sort of an anecdote, recently Tim Cook retired as the CEO of Apple after a very long and successful career, in which he, I think when Steve Jobs passed away, I think Apple had 1 billion revenue, and now with Tim Cook, it's like hundreds of billions. So he did well as a former CEO, COO, Chief Operating Officer. He did well as an operational CEO, but many are now starting to question whether or not his decision to outsource manufacturing of Apple, which is in a sense emblematic for how the whole US tech ecosystem outsourced the manufacturing of everything from their cars to their chips to their technology stack to China and other parts of Southeast Asia, is going to come to bite them.
Right.
And they have tried in recent months and years to remove some of this vulnerability by building plants or partnering up with India, Malaysia, and other countries that are not China, given the holding of the relationships between China and the US. But that just comes to show that the whole world decided, and now we're kind of all paying the price for it, to outsource everything to do with manufacturing to cheaper places where manufacturing is cheaper than in Europe or in America. And now we're seeing a retrenchment to let's bring back manufacturing. And it's going to take years. And those years might, going back to this AI race, be the reason why China could still have the upper hand and that they could still potentially impose a Chinese AI stack to the rest of the world. And then there goes the NVIDIA discussion. Is selling chips, be it the NVIDIA chips, but also now Micron with the high bandwidth memory, which is another American player that is a key player in the memory chip stack. Should they sell chips to China? Should they not? It's an ongoing discussion. I don't have the answer for it, and I just have maybe perspectives that I've collected over the years from both Jensen Huang, but also who wants his chips, for obvious reasons, to be sold to China. His argument is that if you don't sell my chips to China, if you don't allow me to sell the chips to China, the Chinese will just develop their own, and their whole, not just hardware AI ecosystem will be built on maybe Huawei Ascend, but very importantly for NVIDIA and for the Western world, the whole Chinese developer ecosystem, which is one of the biggest in the world. I think it's 50% of all AI developers or in China or Chinese. They would develop their AI models on something that is not CUDA. CUDA is the asset that NVIDIA has that is beyond their actual hardware, the chips, is the architecture that sits between the chips themselves, the GPUs, and the users, CUDA, which is, if I'm not mistaken, Compute Unified Device Architecture. Mm-hmm. And this is basically the brain of the chip. And if China develops its own brain and then developers will use the Chinese brain, no longer CUDA, that's where Jensen has a point to make that, well, that will be bad not just for NVIDIA, but for everybody else. That being said, what we've seen in recent years is that even if NVIDIA had moments in recent years, now I think it's again allowed to sell, but now the Chinese don't want the chips anymore. But then a few years ago, they were not allowed to sell or only allowed to sell lesser powerful chips like the previous generation. The Chinese ecosystem still develops. So I'm now more of an opinion that I think that the debate has just moved on more or less, given that you selling them or not selling them is not going to prevent the Chinese from learning from their past mistakes and double down with subsidies if needed on having their own leaders. What NVIDIA's chips being sold could do in the defense of those who are against Jensen Huang's view is that 3 to 6 months difference between a Chinese closed source model and a American closed source model could be even shortened if they would have access to as many NVIDIA chips as they want. So that is a strong argument that makes me also be a bit on the fence. Both Jensen and his critics on this topic have great arguments, but ultimately my opinion is that China will anyways catch up. How quick? Will it depend just on NVIDIA GPUs being sold? I don't think. It's going to depend on other things now that are bottlenecks that every country, especially the US and China, are trying to overcome.
Yeah. Now, and on the critical raw materials implications, and for Europe, very briefly, I mean, we come to Europe as a main talking point. I noted down before our conversation without fully knowing what they are, but just that the critical raw materials for chips needed are gallium, germanium, silicon, and then those rare earths you mentioned. And the European Commission, of course, has identified that rare earth elements, which are essential for the various components of the chips, China controls 98% of the EU's supply. So, of course, now we have the Critical Raw Materials Act of 2024 that tries to put Europe on the path of diversification. And I think aim by 2030 is to have at least 10% extracted inside the EU, even though I don't think there's that much to be extracted. 40% processed in the EU, right? So getting it from outside is still unclear from where, and how to reduce the dependency. 25% from recycling. I also wanted to ask you, because that you hear that a lot as well, well, maybe the chance is simply that, you know, with now moving forward in the technology and having potentials of reusing old or previously built-in chips, is that a strategy, maybe, the recycling approach, or will it only be a small drop in the water? And lastly, by the way, target of the Critical Raw Materials Act is that a maximum ceiling of 65% can only be sourced from a single country by 2030, which means probably that's the Chinese ceiling. We want to move it from 98% to 65%, still making us, of course, massively vulnerable and dependent. But on the recycling thing, is that a viable option?
The way I understood it is that, yes, you no longer need, at least Europe, I think, would be pretty well off by not having the latest NVIDIA chips, which were always going to be in the highest demand for training models. We could use, as the neo clouds are providing, we could use in our data centers chips that are second generation NVIDIA, and still there will be enough companies paying a premium to have access to them, given that we're in a compute shortage context. Recycling the chips themselves, I'm not an expert in this, and I don't know if you don't need the chip anymore, you can recycle some of its parts to then use to manufacture your own chips. I don't know. I feel also that the EU institutions sometimes need, again, a bit more situational awareness on this topic, because if I'm not mistaken, also there was this CHIPS Act that we wanted to, if I'm not mistaken, manufacture 10% of the chips here, which, yes, I think, especially if you speak about frontier AI chips, I think it's pure delusion to think that you can do it when again, the US and China, the biggest powers in the game, are not able to, and they depend on Taiwan, the small island next to China, to actually do it for them, and they're trying now to source this back.
Sorry, can you explain how much it depends on Taiwan? I remember there's some kind of figure floating around, but
85 to 90%, I think, also of all frontier AI chips in the world are manufactured on one island.
85 to 90% of
something
all,
like that. Yeah, exactly.
I think there's a similar.
It's a similar percentage, like with the China's control of the processing of the rare earth, not the extraction. Again, the underlying part is that the surface of China doesn't have all the rare earths. Chile, Australia, there's plenty of places where you can get many of these rare earths that are not that rare. What we don't have is the capacity to process them. It's where China has this, I think, 90+%. It's not just the extraction, it's the processing, which we in Europe and America have a huge issue, and we have to build back those factories again if we want to process. But yeah, I was giving the example, going back to the CHIPS Act, to this 10%, and I hear now you mentioned 10%. These are nice goals to have, but they're not backed up by the actions I've been seeing. And in some cases, the goals can also be detrimental if we're trying to pursue the quote-unquote sovereignty for us to manufacture our own chips here, frontier AI chips. I mean, that it's not something we could do anyways. Let's focus maybe on seeing, because we do have chip manufacturers that are, I think, in Germany, if I'm not mistaken, Infineon, if I'm not mistaken, is one of them, that are manufacturing not the leading edge chips, but the chips that we have in cars, in phones, and other devices that are not the data centers and NVIDIA's chips. We could double down on that and be a provider for such chips, which were very much bottlenecked during COVID, as we've seen, that our whole European, and in particularly German and French, automaking empire was sort of on hold because they couldn't produce the less advanced chips needed to manufacture cars. We could double down on that because we do have that. We do have advanced manufacturing in Europe, but to get into the chip race in this case, by coming up with factories to manufacture the chips, I think it's delusional. It's going to take way too much money, way too much cost, and we don't have the energy to power them anyway. So us even trying to focus on the frontier end on that point is again delusional. Same with frontier AI. I feel it's a distraction from other things we could actually do, which is we have Mistral. Let's double down on Mistral as the EU to help Mistral be the go-to LLM, since the only European competitive one we have for all public procurement. That could be one way to insulate, but then there goes a point I made recently on LinkedIn to somebody who was praising Mistral, and don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of European champions. I want us to have more, but Mistral is also powered by Microsoft Azure, which then means it's inherently depending not just on Microsoft, but on NVIDIA chips, because Microsoft doesn't have yet their own. Google and Amazon are making their own chips to compete with NVIDIA. That's another discussion. But even our own quote-unquote only AI LLM champion is not entirely our own. It's still powered by the American tech stack. But still, there's ways we can become less dependent by doubling down on them. One other strategy I would love Europe to pursue a bit more, or to leverage a bit more, is to use the choke point that ASML is much better. Because actually, when ASML has stopped selling its devices to China at the peak of the frostening of the US-Chinese relationship, it was, I think at the time, it was even potentially Biden's administration who called ASML's Dutch CEO at the time, now they have a French CEO, to say no longer sell chips to China. It was not the EU. So even if there's one company in Europe that is more crucial than anything else that we have, is ASML in this whole AI race. If we would be better able and equipped to support them, to attract talent, to build more factories, that will be one way for us to get a seat at the table. And I don't think we're doing enough. And I'm sure ASML, public policy people, the few that they have in the area, they would agree. And I would wish for us to see ASML more like the Biden and Trump administration is seeing their chip champions, like NVIDIA in particular. They've been supporting NVIDIA a lot, and AMD, and now Intel with the direct investment. We need similar support to ASML and to its other European-based suppliers. So what I'm trying to say is that we should not pursue pipe dreams, but look at the reality, even if it might not be pretty at all times, and look at the areas where we do have strengths that we could double down on. AI talent, how can we keep it here or help it return from the US or elsewhere? We have some of the most brilliant, OpenAI's half of their research team was, I think, European-born. Anthropic's two co-founders, their brother and sister, Italian descent. Anthropic, if rumor is true, even before their confrontation with the Department of Defense, did offer themselves to the, if I'm not mistaken, UK government, also within the EU, to collaborate a bit more closely, seeing that their US government relationship is getting more difficult. How much we've actually jumped on this opportunity and bring Anthropic here as the more European values option or the more AI safety focused option, we haven't done enough. And I think Anthropic would definitely agree with this. How many political leaders in Europe, when the Trump administration decided to block immigration to the US, I think it's at the all-time low of how many people go to the US to work or study. How many European leaders have actually made a concrete call to bring some of that talent in Europe that wanted to go to the US? Not enough, I think.
Yeah, quite a few. It's difficult. There's almost a podcast in itself. The big problem of attracting US talent is salary. So especially if you want to bring them to universities, for example, and the culture. As you know better than I do, but I look at it from a university perspective, the availability of capital, of investment opportunities, the entire ecosystem is simply still more attractive in the US than in Europe.
But I was not referring to the US talent. It's attracting talent that wanted to go to the US from elsewhere.
Yes. Yeah.
We have Indians.
So we have to be more attractive.
Yeah.
But even there, of course, our migration rules are not that much more liberal, let's put it this way. I think we have a lot of work to do ourselves.
We have a lot of work there,
Yeah. Great. Before zooming out from Europe again to the global level, and then we come to an end on this occasion, is the entire discussion about the EU AI Act. Now, again, it would require an entire separate episode to delve really into it. But there is, in that conversation about strategies, about AI, there's always this quip, which I don't like entirely, but it's of course not entirely wrong, that the US and China, they have the AI infrastructure and the models. The 5 layers you now outlined, and Europe, has a little bit a chip manufacturer, as you mentioned, but then it has mostly regulation, a little bit like Canada's approach as well. Now, I don't like it because I think regulation is very important, and and the EU AI Act in its different iterations is an important tool for progress. But we see now also a kind of
dilution,
or rowing back almost to a certain extent, right? The omnibus approach now to it, quite a lot of stuff is watered down. The transparency rules of companies having to kind of register their different AI products, but also safety and security requirements. They move from mandatory a bit more now towards voluntary. How do you interpret this? And on the one hand, I can see the argument that this might make it easier for companies to press ahead, right? If you look at the US and China, there were no guardrails almost in terms of it's no brakes, all innovation, so to say. On the other hand, of course, if there was one pillar Europe also had, then it was a more responsible approach and minimizing risks whilst trying to keep opportunities going, and also if I think about data privacy and all these things. So where do you stand on that, and how do you analyze those developments?
I will recall an event I attended a few years ago where one of the co-rapporteurs was speaking, and he's somebody I look up to, so in no way I wanted to necessarily put him in a bad position, but maybe unintentionally I did a bit. I've asked him, taking a parallel from the tech sector in Silicon Valley, whether or not being an early mover on anything, in this case on regulation, might come to bite us. Because in the tech space, Facebook or Meta now wasn't the first social network, Google was not the first search engine, but they were able to sort of build on the shoulders of quote-unquote giants and build something better that then eventually eliminated the original founder. And I was more prescient than I realized at the time, because us being so adamant of being the first continent that has some regulation around AI, and that's a purely personal view, of course, was not, in my opinion, the best approach at the time, seeing this moving target, because it was obviously nobody could have predicted that OpenAI would launch ChatGPT whilst the whole European political apparatus was in the midst of developing this quintessential piece of legislation. So obviously nobody can be blamed, nobody could have predicted that. But then I'm a much bigger fan of the UK approach post-Brexit. One of the few things that I really do like what they've done, which is they took a step back, saw what existing regulation applies to AI, tried to still collaborate a bit more with the US tech companies, given that they are the key players, and still more more closely aligned with our values than Chinese players. Whilst we were put in a position to take something through the legislative process fast, something that at the time the policymakers thought it's going to be good and it's going to inspire the whole world. It has, similarly to the GDPR, inspired the world. I think South Korea already has an AI legislation that is being enforced. But as with the GDPR, we provide the menu, others choose from it, and actually are faster to implement. The big question remains implementation. And as we see now with the digital omnibus, it's kind of, for me, the worst that can happen, because, okay, you had a piece of legislation which was very stringent and maybe not perfect, no legislation is perfect, but at least try to enforce it. Because what the business ecosystem wants most, or more than anything, is clarity. And having this sort of a strategy of pushing the can down the road to postpone, to dilute, it's creating even more uncertainty, even though the intentions of the commission are good. They saw that they maybe made some mistakes in terms of how stringent they were on some things, and that it does hurt to some degree innovation. But I do believe strongly in the need for regulation, and that Europe can play a key role in this dimension and this discussion. But I would add another element that is maybe contrarian, like some of the elements I maybe added earlier and in our previous conversation, which is that I always learn from different industries and apply those lessons in this case in the policy EU bubble, quote unquote, or Brussels bubble. One is that what happened in the story of the founding of Anthropic, it was a personal, professional conflict between Dario Amodei and a few other researchers that left OpenAI to start their own, more AI safety focused company to compete equally and in a sort of a democratic, capitalistic way with OpenAI. He didn't go and start a party. And I'm not saying this, I do encourage more people to go into politics that could and have a tech background and could change things. But what I'm trying to say is that what Europe actually might need more than regulation is to have a European champion that shows you can be competitive whilst having European values and being rules-based.
Correct.
That's something that no American president or Chinese president can compete with, because then the people, the consumers and companies decide if they would go with the, let's say, Mistral, if they would be our competitive, actually, frontier model with European values. If the market decides they're the best with European values, then that's the way we imbue European values into this discussion.
But isn't that the argument for the EU AI Act? So why now the digital omnibus? I mean, you could, I mean, and I still haven't seen the strong argument against, strangling innovation. I mean, that could have been a third way, an interesting model. So you're doubling down and saying the EU AI Act, even though, as I agree with you, it wasn't perfect, but that's our vision of how this entire industry has to develop. And now let's support the companies that choose to produce it with all the caveats we outlined in the beginning, Europe made, so to say, in line with an EU AI Act that takes certain risks seriously. So I think, and the lack of certainty now in the business environment comes precisely now from this watering down movement now. So maybe one should have stuck by the initial approach, even though a lot of pressure, of course, and we should also not forget that, right? In the Brussels bubble, there's a lot of pressure from different sides on the Commission now in loosening. Also, not only from Europe, but outside, of course, in particular.
Of course. I definitely see your point in that this watering down moment, and even more so the watering down, because there are some good proposals within the omnibus, but at the same time, they just prolong this uncertainty. Yeah. And that's, I think, the worst that could happen. So yes, Agreed. Your scenario would have been better, but I think even the watering down moment came as a result of the decision to be the first to try to put together this piece of legislation. Sure. which I would have postponed until we can actually figure it out. But obviously, tell the co-rapporteurs, which was their chance to make a mark, and the former commissioner for the internal market, tell them, and I'm empathizing with them. They're humans. They wanted to leave their mark with something that is a historic piece of legislation. Did it come to actually help us? Well, it's not being even enforced yet, and that's actually the key element. Exactly. It was a great piece of legislation that exists somewhere in the ether that is neither being enforced nor even living up to its initial promise. So what do we have? A lot of time that could have been focused on a bit different things, maybe focusing more on the fostering of the ecosystem. This 20th regime, this could have been a better focus that we have hopefully sorted out in the previous mandate and then we now can enforce. And I do want to make this point, even though I'm preaching both here to the choir and in Brussels amongst our peer group, many of the issues that Europe have are nothing to do with what's happening in Brussels. It's the imperfect nature of our union, which is not fully, and I'm now going to put my federalist hat, it's not fully European United States. Because even if von der Leyen's commission wants the best, and I'm sure intentionally they do want the best, even though sometimes the actions are not maybe followed by as urgently as needed or as focused as needed, but the intentions are there, but they're being blocked at member state level. So until we maybe change the treaties and get to a closer union, I think essentially everything we've discussed over the past hour is pointless, because I don't want to be too pessimistic here, but I think very few things can actually change unless there is a decision-making power that ideally sits in Brussels that has, if not full authority, but some sort of a more power to actually deliver on its promises, and especially the key defense, education, employment, healthcare, the key priorities that are still decided at the member state level and can be blocked at the member state level. So until we get that sorted, everything else is just hard to implement or do.
Fully agree with you. And this is just another, the entire AI discussion is just another example that speeding up and deepening integration is not a naive idealist pipe dream of some Europhiles. It really is an absolute necessity, strategic necessity. And the quicker we move that, the better. That said, enough about Europe. On the global side, zooming out for the final part of this conversation. Now, so we have, as you really well described, this AI race. We can go into details about the externalities, the costs of it, also environmental costs. Like we described in the first episode of this mini-series, the economic costs. If you now scale this open to the global level, we'll see, of course, this two-group division again of a very small group of industrialized states, Western states plus China and India, you said to a certain extent, moving ahead. It's a handful of groups that can control it, can control also the benefits of all of that, creates a lot of risks for the entire globe, and then the majority of states, of course, left out of this development and having to make choices. So what, from your perspective, from where you're sitting, are the major global risks here, and how can they be mitigated through a governance approach, a global governance approach even? And who should do it?
It's a great question. And for me, the biggest risk is exactly the paradigm you mentioned earlier, the context of this conversation, the AI race. As soon as something becomes a race, it becomes zero-sum. It becomes a race between winners and losers. And I think that's a paradigm that I'm afraid, unless something breaks, some accident happens, and given the leadership both in the US and in China, and the lack of leadership in many member states, it's going to be hard to get out of that race voluntarily. And similar to, if we look back at the nuclear arms race, there's parallels to it, and I know some people are taken aback by these, and I'm one that actually think we can learn from history, and we can learn a bit from those models, and hopefully not need another accident to the magnitude of a Nagasaki and Hiroshima. An accident with inverted commas, of course, because it was no accident, but hopefully we don't need another disaster to happen before the US and China in particular, because let's be honest, the EU, other middle powers can do all they want. They can join forces, they can hold hands, but without the US and China at the table, when it comes to AI, nothing can truly be done. Still, it will be good for middle powers to work a bit more closely together to at least get a seat at the table and to maybe coerce, for lack of a better term, China and the US on certain issues, pull them back on certain issues if they use bottlenecks like ASML or Taiwan does so with TSMC. But until that happens, I think until we get out of this race paradigm and we sit at the table and we have some sort of a non-proliferation act, it's going to be hard to see, a good outcome for humanity overall from this quote-unquote AI race.
One scenario, of course, is that, and that's, by the way, often the scenario in global governance discussions, it's not about the big powers. I mean, they take care of themselves and they don't stick to rules. Let's say this in general. It really is about the rest, how they mobilize, how they organize, how they promote alternative solutions. I mean, do you see in that realm alternative poles, possibilities for different coalitions?
That's the problem. We're so dependent when it comes to the tech stack, in particular the AI stack on the US providers in China. I was reading recently an ITRE committee commissioned report for the European Parliament. And again, it's the cloud layer. It's the cybersecurity layer where you also depend on Israeli providers. On every layer of the stack, on the consumer front, it's mostly American. Like, good luck finding an alternative next week to, at the same time, if let's say they all go dark on us, Meta's suite of apps, Google Cloud, Microsoft Cloud, Amazon Cloud, e-commerce. We just don't have the alternatives on all layers that are at the same level or even close to the same level with the US providers in particular. Mm-hmm. So it's hard, it's not impossible to get there maybe in time, but time is also something we don't really have. So whilst I strongly believe middle powers should work closely together, I see it as a role more of as a collaboration that would lead to a stronger negotiating chip and a seat at the table with the US and China in this whole discussion first. So a seat at the table and then a stronger bargaining power to make sure the US and China, who are like two kids on the playground engage in a fight, they don't do something too crazy. So we do have, as a coalition, if we could build it, of middle powers, we do have that role to play. But even in that sense, who initiated Pax Silica? It was the American administration. It was
Pax Silica? What do you mean?
Pax Silica. It's an alliance of democratic countries when it comes to becoming even more quote-unquote sovereign, to keep going back to this term, on the chips front.
Right.
It was America bringing together Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, a few other key countries that have companies with leading roles in this AI stack, specifically focused on the chips, to bring them even more under their sort of influence and close collaboration.
Right.
It was initiated by, I think, if I'm not mistaken, one of the AI advisors of Trump. Kratios is his family name. We can Google him afterwards. But yeah, it's another initiative that came from the US. It didn't come from Europe or one of its like-minded allies. Whilst it should, it's exactly what we should do. Have a Pax Silica that maybe doesn't include, if they don't want to be part of it, the US and China at first. But if you bring all the players that I mentioned now, that are especially ASML, TSMC, the players in South Korea and Japan, you already have quite a good leveraging power, I think, because the US and China depend on these companies. The companies themselves depend on US and China, which is a challenge because good luck banning ASML from selling their devices to the US. God forbid, that might mean the end of the company itself, because a lot of the business comes from the US. So I don't hope that we will get to that, but see middle ways that you can still leverage companies like ASML to bid a bit for the European interest, not just for their own, obviously, corporate interest, which is to make money, which obviously we're supporting them because that means Netherlands and Europe as a whole could be better off in the long term. But we don't do enough on that coalition building. So I think definitely you're right. Coalitions of middle powers have a key role to play, but we're not doing them as quickly as it's needed. And I hope we will, because that's our only chance to not just be competitive, but remain relevant. As I said, on a lot of the topics we discussed, you gave the percentage on rare earths. I gave the percentage on the dependency on TSMC. It's a matter of relevance, not of competitiveness, when the percentages are so lopsided.
Sure. David, thanks so much. All the time we have for this episode. Lots of different aspects that you raised there. In fact, in the last episode of the mini-series, next time we might also pick up again on AGI, artificial general intelligence, transformative AI as you refer to it, but mostly we will focus on the implications on human rights and democracy. But for now, thank you so much and see you soon.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Thank you for listening to the State of the Globe podcast. For more information and analysis, visit globalgovernance.eu. Until next time.